Hi everybody, thank you for joining me once again as I continue to take a look at Josh McDowell's Evidence That Demands a Verdict, critiquing it, analyzing it from my atheist perspective. In this video, we will complete our look at Part 2, The Case for Jesus, with Chapter 10, which is titled The Support of Deity, The Great Proposition. McDowell begins this chapter by asking three questions. First, he asks, if God became man, then what would he be like? And did Jesus possess the attributes of God? And then, to better explore the answers to those questions, he poses a third question, which is, why would God become a man? Well, McDowell suggests an answer to that last question. Why would God become a man? Quote, one reason would be to communicate with us more effectively. Imagine you are watching a farmer plow a field. You notice that an anthill will be plowed under by the farmer on his next time around. Because you love ants, you run to the anthill to warn its tiny inhabitants. First, you shout to them the impending danger, but they continue their work. You then try many other forms of communication, but nothing seems to get through to the imperiled ants. You soon realize that the only way you can really reach them is by becoming one of them. Now, there are a few problems with McDowell's anthill metaphor here. For one thing, it's either confused or deliberately misleading as to how it represents God and God's role in all of this. Plowing under the anthill represents unsaved people going to hell, right? Our death and our damnation is the plowing under, and we are the ants. Well, McDowell seems to be saying that God is the person trying to warn the ants about the farmer plowing up their anthill. But if we take McDowell's beliefs about Christianity and the way the universe works to be true, then God is also the farmer, isn't he? Or if he isn't the farmer, he's the one responsible for putting the farmer on that tractor. Which begs the question, if he cares so much about the ants, why doesn't he take it up with the farmer? Or an even better question, why did he put the anthill in this field where it's in danger of being plowed under in the first place? Since we all know that God is far from the impotent bystander yelling at ants in this metaphor. That is not what McDowell believes about God. God is an all-powerful agent. Also, if God realized that the only way to communicate with the ants was to become an ant himself, why did he do it only once? Why did he become an ant, live a normal ant lifespan, allow himself to die, and then allow thousands of years to pass without ever becoming an ant again? It doesn't make much sense in the big picture, does it? God realizes that yelling at the ants doesn't work, so he becomes an ant. He deals personally with relatively few ants before dying himself, and then things go right back to the way they were before. The ants alive today are in the exact same situation in terms of their communication with God as the ants who lived before God became an ant. There's no personal God in their lives. There's no personification. There's no human incarnation, or should I say ant incarnation of God that they can go to for evidence, for proof, for personal guidance. It's exactly the same for modern ants as it was for ants before God incarnated as an ant. So what was the fucking point? Finally, and just to finally get away from that ant metaphor, McDowell ignores the times in the Old Testament when God appears personally, physically, in human form, often to people, to communicate with them clearly and directly, without feeling the need to undergo a full-on human incarnation. McDowell references the prophets of the Old Testament, who he says gave us the words of God, but don't the prophets claim to be getting these words firsthand from God himself? Are there not episodes in the Old Testament where it is made clear, or at least very strongly implied, that God appears physically and interacts with people? With Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, with Abraham, with Jacob, and if you want to count the burning bush as a form of direct personal communication, with Moses as well. In fact, speaking of Jacob, God wrestles with Jacob. And Jacob says following that wrestling match, quote, "For I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved." That's taken from Genesis chapter 32, verse 30, which, speaking of the perfect harmonious Word of God, seems to contradict a verse from the New Testament, specifically the Gospel of John. And I only bring this up because McDowell actually quotes this verse on the same page as the anthill metaphor and the discussion of God's attempts to communicate with us. And the verse is John 1:18, and it reads, "No man hath seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father, he hath declared him." So the Bible is the perfect and true Word of God. Yet, John writes that no man has ever seen God, while Jacob declares that he has seen God face to face, and more than that, has actually wrestled with him. Sure sounds like a direct contradiction to me. And I wouldn't have spoken about it to you in this video if Josh McDowell himself hadn't reminded me of it and brought it to my attention. So thanks, Josh. And anyway, the point is, the communication, excuse, reason, whatever, for the incarnation of Jesus seems like a strange explanation for why God would choose to incarnate himself in the person of Jesus, since he demonstrates throughout the Old Testament that he is quite capable and willing to assume an earthly form and talk to people directly without going through the motions of being conceived, being born, and living out a normal human lifespan as one of us. So, McDowell asks, if God did take human form, and he's talking now only about the human form of Jesus and completely ignoring the times that God takes human form in the Old Testament, which McDowell does not mention even a single time, what traces of God's divine presence would he leave behind for us to find? McDowell lists 8 telltale signs that he thinks we should expect to find if indeed God chose to incarnate himself in human form. The 8 signs: 1, an utterly unique entrance into human history. 2, a sinless life. 3, miracles. 4, a more perfect life than any human has ever lived. 5, the greatest words ever spoken. 6, a lasting and universal influence. 7, the ability to satisfy humanity's spiritual hunger. 8, the ability to overcome death. McDowell declares that it is clearly evident that Jesus satisfied all 8 of these expectations, which he just made up. So let's take the 8 one at a time. An utterly unique entrance into human history. The subject of this section is the virgin birth. And can you guess where the evidence that this virgin birth even took place is going to come from? Go ahead, guess. We'll see if you're right in a second. Okay. Quote, "The main body of testimony concerning the virgin birth occurs in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. However, the Old Testament predicted the Messiah's unusual conception hundreds of years before Matthew and Luke ever wrote their Gospels." So, once again, as everywhere else in this book up to this point, the evidence we will be considering will be evidence from the Bible. That's the evidence. And also, once again, McDowell unwittingly suggests a far more plausible, naturalistic explanation for the stories of the virgin birth found in the Gospels. And that explanation is the early followers of Jesus were well aware of the prophecy that said the Messiah would be born of a virgin, and so, wanting to convince people that Jesus had in fact been the Messiah, some of their stories about Jesus came to include that detail. It is far more likely that the stories told about Jesus were shaped to fit the prophecies and the expectations of the Messiah than that Jesus was in fact conceived and born by a virgin and was in fact the promised Messiah, and in fact that there even is such a thing as the Messiah. The naturalistic explanation is far more plausible. McDowell spends several pages arguing about the meaning of the Hebrew word alma, which appears in the verse Isaiah 7:14, which McDowell claims as a clear prophecy of the virgin birth. And he spends a lot of time justifying Isaiah 7:14 as a messianic prophecy and a prophecy of the virgin birth. And that verse, Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, reads, quote, "Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." That, of course, from the King James Version. Well, the meaning of Alma is so important because that is the word that is translated as virgin in most English translations, and of course, as I just read in the King James translation. But it doesn't usually mean virgin, or at least it doesn't have to mean virgin. It can also mean a woman who is of age to be married, or a woman who is of, say, childbearing age, a sexually mature woman. McDowell and the authors he cites for support claim that, given the cultural context, we can infer that any woman referred to as the word Alma was a virgin. Another way of saying it would be a maid or a maiden or a young lady. You would assume, given the cultural context, that anyone called Alma would probably have been a virgin. And therefore, the translation is valid, and this verse is clearly a prophecy foretelling the virgin birth of Jesus. And they reference other usages of the word Alma, and they argue that the women referred to in all of those examples were also certainly virgins, just as the prophesied woman in this verse from Isaiah. But to me, this misses the point. McDowell's prolonged defense of translating Alma as virgin, motivated by his desire to interpret Isaiah 7:14 as a foretelling of the virgin birth, which may have been the same motivation of the translators in translating it as a virgin shall conceive. It begs the question, if Isaiah 7:14 is a prophecy of the virgin birth, that is, if God intended to announce through this verse that someday a virgin would bear a son, and that this miraculous conception would be a sign of something momentous from God, why didn't the author of Isaiah use the more common word for virgin to emphasize that that miraculous conception would be the sign from God that was promised? And that word, by the way, that more common word for virgin is Bethulah, which appears in the Bible 50 times and is translated in the King James Version as virgin 38 of those 50 times. And compare that to the word Alma, which appears only 7 times in the Bible and is translated in the King James as virgin 4 of those 7 times. So it seems to me that if the author of Isaiah wanted to make it clear that he was foretelling the birth of a child to a virgin rather than to a maiden or a young woman, then he would have referred to her using Bethulah, a word that appears 5 times, by the way, in the book of Isaiah and is translated virgin in the King James each time. So the author of Isaiah used this more definitive word to represent virgin elsewhere in his text in the book of Isaiah, but for some reason, when he's referring to this supposed momentous prophecy about the virgin birth, he doesn't use the more obvious word for virgin. He uses the more open to interpretation word of Alma. So McDowell goes on to argue that the verse makes no sense unless we assume that it is referring to a virgin birth, because it is promising a sign from God. And if the birth of the child referred to in the verse was not a miraculous birth, then how could it be recognized by anyone at the time as a sign from God? Well, as with the messianic interpretation of the suffering servant passage of Isaiah, McDowell ignores the Jewish interpretation of Isaiah 7:14, which holds that the verse doesn't refer to the coming of the Messiah at all. Not just Jesus, but just the generic promised Messiah, but instead to the non-miraculous birth of a significant person, probably King Hezekiah, who was the king of Judah, who is referenced later on in the book of Isaiah. In the Jewish interpretation, it is the person born and the accomplishments that come later in his life that amounts to the sign from God. Hezekiah, the great king, he was the sign from God, not the miraculous circumstances under which a person is born. But anyway, McDowell is absolutely convinced that Isaiah 7:14's Alma is necessarily a virgin and that the verse is referring to a miraculous conception, a virgin conception. But which Alma is being referenced specifically? Well, McDowell has an idea about that. Quote, "Since we have determined that the Alma of Isaiah 7:14 is a young virgin woman of marriageable age who becomes pregnant through supernatural means, we can safely conclude that the only woman in history who fits this criterion is the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus Christ." Well, if we don't count the mothers of Buddha and Zoroaster and Huji and Huitzilopochtli, anyway, given McDowell's rather loose concept of history, I think it's only fair that we bring those in, but he leaves those out. So, McDowell turns then to objections to the accuracy of the birth narratives recorded in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. The two objections he responds to are the discrepancies between the genealogies in Matthew and Luke and the census, which supposedly brought Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem when Jesus was born. And we've already discussed the census previously in this series. And McDowell's ultimate solution to the genealogies is the standard apologist assumption that Matthew is tracing the lineage of Jesus through Joseph, his legal father, while Luke is tracing the lineage of Jesus through Mary, his biological mother. Is it too simplistic of me to say that my biggest problem with the birth narrative of Jesus isn't the contradictory genealogy or the invented census, but the claim that a miraculous conception and virgin birth took place? I mean, once again, as with the claims of Jesus to be God and the beliefs about the resurrection of Jesus, McDowell devotes his effort to arguing that a claim was made, not that the claim is actually true. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that Isaiah 7:14 is intended as a prophecy foretelling the birth of a son to a woman who was a virgin. And let's just say that Matthew and Luke weren't intentionally shaping their stories to fit the conditions of that prophecy, but were sincerely claiming that Jesus' mother was a virgin when he was conceived. So what? Those are claims. Where's the evidence that this actually happened? That Jesus really was the product of a miraculous conception and a virgin birth? The answer is, there is no evidence. As with Jesus' claims of his own deity and his resurrection, the best McDowell can do is cite evidence that early church fathers believed in the virgin birth. He offers no compelling evidence that it actually happened. He only reiterates the claims that it happened. That is not good enough to compel belief. Or at least, it shouldn't be. Next section, if God became a man, then we would expect him to be without sin. McDowell offers 4 different views of Jesus, all of which show him to have lived a sinless life. And first, there is Jesus' view of himself. Evidence from the Gospels clearly shows that Jesus thought of himself as sinless. Quote, "Christ's self-conscious purity is astonishing. Every Christian knows that the nearer he approaches God, the more aware he becomes of his sin. However, with Christ, this was not the case. Jesus lived more closely to God than anyone else, and yet he was free from all sense of sin." You can see that we are deep into how many angels can dance on the head of a pin territory here. Next, there is Jesus as he was viewed by his friends. More references to the New Testament to establish that Jesus' friends all thought he was sinless too. Finally, there is the assessment of history, not actual history, because there is very little in the way of historical evidence for Jesus, most particularly for the details of his life, which might lead us to conclude that he was a sinless person. Nevertheless, McDowell quotes a succession of Christian authors, all of whom agree that the sinless life of Jesus was an extraordinary thing, which absolutely did happen for sure. Next section, if God became a man, then we would expect him to manifest his supernatural presence in the form of supernatural acts, miracles. McDowell lists the miracles of Jesus as told in the New Testament, then addresses critics who deny the authenticity of the miracles. Because see, the thing is, Jesus performed his miracles out in the open, vulnerable to scrutiny from skeptics. Quote, let's consider, for example, the biblical account of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. Bernard Rahm observes, quote, if the raising of Lazarus was actually witnessed by John and recorded faithfully by him when still in the soundness of faculties and memory, for purposes of evidence, it is the same as if we were there and saw it. And he was quoting Rahm's Protestant Christian evidences there. Well, the deliberate lack of curiosity and skepticism on display here by McDowell and Rahm is appalling. How are we supposed to determine that the raising of Lazarus was actually witnessed by John when the only record of that event is the testimony of John? Yet again, we have the demand that we believe a claim from the Bible on its own authority. If someone claims that they saw a dead person miraculously come back to life, the incredible nature of that claim should inspire our skepticism, not our unthinking acceptance. And that skepticism should be multiplied, and that acceptance withheld even more so if the claim in question was made by an anonymous person 2,000 years ago. McDowell argues that one cannot simply ignore the miracles of Jesus and still call oneself a Christian. The miracles of Jesus were central to his life and message because they authenticated his identity. He again quotes Bernard Rahm from his book, Protestant Christian Evidences. Quote, Jesus came not only preaching but performing miracles, and the apostles from time to time worked wonders. It was the miracle authenticating the religion at every point. Every point except any point in the last 2,000 years. Next section, if God became a man, then we would expect him to live more perfectly than any human who has ever lived. Personally, I don't see why we should expect the God of the Bible to be that great of a guy, seeing as how he spends most of the Old Testament committing genocide, demanding worship, and ordering people to start wars. But evangelical Christians like McDowell are well practiced in the art of kissing God's ass. So that's what we get in this section. Since McDowell never really defines what he means by live more perfectly in any objective way, the section consists of nothing more than Christians, quoted by McDowell, taking turns proclaiming what an awesome guy Jesus was. The persuasive effect of this is similar, I would imagine, to seeing one member of the Korean Workers' Party after another step forward to sing the praises of Kim Il-sung. If God became a man, then certainly he would speak the greatest words ever spoken. The concept of the greatest words ever spoken, like the concept of living more perfectly, is inherently subjective, and McDowell makes no effort to establish any objective standards by which we could judge what makes the words of Jesus so great compared to the words of other religious or historical figures. So again, we get a prolonged act of verbal fellatio directed at Jesus, with McDowell quoting one Christian after another, all of whom express the opinion that the words of Jesus are just the wisest, most amazing, wonderful words anyone ever spoke. What a shame, then, that Jesus almost certainly didn't actually speak any of the words attributed to him in the Bible. Oh well, minor details. Next section, if God became a man, then we would expect him to have a lasting and universal influence. And McDowell extends the gangbang into a third section of the chapter, this time quoting a series of Christian authors describing in appropriately worshipful tones how influential the life of Christ has been on the world. Not addressed in this section, not mentioned or even hinted at, is the very large portion of human civilization today on which the life of Jesus has been practically no influence at all. The declarations of the influence of Jesus, are decidedly Eurocentric in character, a fact of which McDowell, his cultural bias, as blinding as it is impenetrable, seems utterly unaware. Next section, if God became a man, then we would expect him to satisfy the spiritual hunger in humanity. Jesus fills that God-shaped hole in all of us, see. McDowell demonstrates this by, you guessed it, quoting a series of Christians who talk about how fulfilling their faith in Christ is, and how they were satisfied, and how their lives have been enriched by Jesus. If I may right now, I'd like to share with you an incomplete list of groups of people whose spiritual hunger, whatever the fuck that means, is not satisfied by Jesus. Okay? Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Wiccans, Baha'is, Jains, Sikhs, Zoroastrians, Shintoists, Unitarian Universalists, Scientologists, Taoists, and atheists. Next section, if God became a man, then we would expect him to overcome humanity's most pervasive and feared enemy, death. Jesus died, he was buried, he came back to life. We've already heard this story. So, I'll skip to the end. Quote, "The evidence shows that Jesus is alive," Hebrews 13:8, "and that, quote, this same Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will so come in like manner as you saw him go into heaven." Acts 1:11. Now that, at last, is a point that Josh McDowell and I can agree on. I, too, have a firm belief that just as I saw him taken up into heaven, I will someday see him come back from heaven. I didn't see the former. I don't think I'll ever see the latter. That's it for this chapter. I will be back in the next video in the series to begin part 3 of this book, which is titled The Case for and Against Christianity. And in that video, I will be covering 3 chapters. The chapters get shorter from this point on. So I will be covering chapter 11, Is the Bible from God? Chapter 12, The Presupposition of Anti-Supernaturalism. And chapter 13, Archaeology and Biblical Criticism. Those 3 chapters all covered in the next video in the series. Thank you guys, as always, so very much for watching. I appreciate your interest in this. I appreciate your comments, your questions, your arguments, etc. Please feel free to comment on this, make arguments, make amplifications of points that I've made, contradict me, correct me, agree with me, whatever you want to do. I appreciate the interaction and the interest and your viewership and everything. I'm so gratified that this is of use to so many of you and of interest. So thanks for that as always, and I will see you in the next video in the series.